Hello everyone, welcome to this People's Health revision video. The topic we're looking at is medieval times. You can see that the medieval times existed from 1250 to 1500, and in this revision video we're going to be looking at the impact of living conditions, response to epidemics, improving public health. And all the time just be aware of those key factors: beliefs, attitudes and values, local and national government, science and technology, urbanisation, and wealth and poverty. These are the key factors that affect change within people's health. So let's find out more about people's health in the medieval times. So for this topic, there are four main areas for you to know about: the characteristics and features of medieval Britain, living conditions such as housing, food, clean water and waste. They can sometimes be referred to as lifestyles. Responses to epidemics. So the epidemic in this time period is the Black Death from 1348 to 1350. And then approaches to public health in late medieval towns and also monasteries. This just reminds you about how you're going to be assessed on this unit. So for the People's Health unit, there are a number of different exam questions, 1A, 1B and 1C, which are knowledge-based questions. Question 2 is a write a clear and organised summary. Question 3 is a causation question, a why question, and then you have a choice of either question 4 or question 5, which is a longer essay type question where you need to be able to respond to an historical interpretation. So there's a little bit of guidance there for how you tackle those questions. Some key historical concepts that you're going to come across in medieval people's health. A cesspit is a pit or chamber used for collecting human waste. A conduit is a small fountain or water pipe. A coroner is an official who investigates violent or suspicious deaths. Dearth, which is a good word to use, a lack of food, such as after a poor harvest or the Great Famine of 1315 to 1316. An epidemic is a disease that affects a large number of people at the same time. Ergotism was a medieval disease, sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, named after the saint who was believed to have the cure for the disease. It was a disease caused by eating infected rye bread, caused by a fungus, and it was most common among poor people. Flagellants were people who whipped themselves to try and avoid catching a plague, pretty common in Italy, less common in England, although there were some examples. Four humours is the idea that there are four liquids such as blood, black bile, phlegm and yellow bile, four liquids that make up the human body according to Greek doctors, and the idea that you would get ill if those humours are out of balance with each other. A gong farmer is a person who cleans out cesspits for a living. Guilds, organisations responsible for keeping high standards in a particular trade, common in the towns. Latrine, a toilet with no system for flushing. A literal psalter, it was a 14th century prayer book, which is an important source for telling us about medieval life. Miasma, the idea that bad smells can cause disease and there would be invisible fumes in the air that would cause disease. A midden is a dunghill or pile of rubbish. A monastery is a place where monks live and pray, and they very much set the standard for public health during this time. And pottage is a thick vegetable soup. It's actually quite healthy and probably rather tasty as well. So what were the key characteristics and features of medieval Britain? Well, firstly, in terms of farming and food, most medieval peasants would have worked on the land and done physical work. In some ways that would have kept them healthy, but they were obviously vulnerable to the frequent bad harvests, which could lead to famine, like the Great Famine from 1315 to 1316. Bad harvests, if it didn't lead to starvation, could certainly lead to higher food prices, and therefore people would suffer from hunger, and that would affect their health as well. Medieval towns were fairly small by today's standards. There were major towns were obviously places like London, but also places like York, Norwich, Ipswich, for example. Very busy, the medieval towns. They contained guilds, crafts, trades. All your traders, like your dyers and your tanners and your butchers, would be in the towns. The towns would become very busy on market days when people would bring goods to market to sell, including live animals that would be brought to the medieval towns by people called drovers, who would drive them across the country. So all of this bringing lots of people together could obviously spread disease. Virtually everyone in medieval towns was a Christian, a member of the Catholic Church. There were many different churches, many cathedrals and monasteries. So because of this, and this ties in with a factor of beliefs and attitudes, many people believed that disease was caused by God, often as a punishment for sins. Technology during this time was really limited. There were things like water mills and windmills, but most things that were made were done by hand. The printing press didn't appear until the 1470s, so books were extremely expensive up until then, which meant it very difficult for new ideas to spread. So most of the books and new ideas would be contained within religious institutions such as monasteries. Very few people in medieval times could read and write anyway. There was no understanding that germs caused disease. There were no microscopes, so of course germs could not be seen. In terms of government, medieval people were ruled over by kings, and they were not interested in people's health. The money raised through taxes was mainly used for the benefit of the king and his court. They also used some of the money to fight wars. But yeah, they didn't see it as their responsibility to look after people's health. There was very little response from the government to the Black Death epidemic. There was the famous order from King Edward III, which we'll look at a little bit later on. But aside from that, not much impact. So here we have an image of the Luttrell Psalter, which was a 14th century prayer book made by Sir Geoffrey Luttrell, who was a knight from Lincolnshire. And it's a really important source for telling us about everyday life in medieval times. Around about 90% of medieval people would have lived in villages. Most people, as we said, would have worked in farming, and peasants would suffer and even starve during the bad harvests. 10% of the population died in the Great Famine of 1315, 1316. So as we've seen, in terms of beliefs and attitudes, medieval people were mostly Christians. They believed that God could punish people by sending disease. There was a disease called ergotism, which was actually caused by eating infected rye bread, but it was known as St. Anthony's fire after the Christian saint they believed would cure it. Really, really nasty, horrible disease with loads of impact on your skin, made you eventually go mad. Medieval people also believed in ideas such as miasma, the idea that bad smells can cause disease, and the theory of the four humours. And you can see in the other image there somebody getting a treatment which is known as bloodletting, which was again common in medieval times. The belief that you were ill because you had too much blood and therefore you had to get rid of blood from your body. So as we've seen, most medieval people would have lived in villages. One of the key aspects to think about in terms of living conditions and housing is there is a big difference, diversity of experience between rich people and poor people, and also diversity in terms of living in the villages and living in the towns. So firstly, houses in the village. Well, the lord of the manor would have lived in a large house set aside from the rest of the village. Peasant houses themselves would have varied in size, but most peasants lived in small, simple huts made of woven sticks and covered in mud, like the little one that you can see below there. Animals would be brought into the home at night, particularly in winter. There would be open fires which would burn in houses with smoke escaping through a thatched roof. There would have been very little light into these homes at all. You can see there's no real kind of windows that they have. There's certainly no glazing that would have gone on in medieval times. Their homes are pretty basic, as you can see there. Even in terms of lighting, medieval people wouldn't have been able to really afford things like candles. So, you know, at night time it would have just been really dark, and it would have been the light from the fire which would have kept any kind of light within the house. In terms of housing in towns, the houses were built very close together in the centre of towns. Only the wealthy people would have had gardens. Workshops of craftsmen and tradesmen were often part of their houses. People were supposed to clean the drains and streets near their houses, but of course not everybody did so. So you can see there an image of a medieval town. The rivers in medieval towns would get extremely polluted. It was very crowded. Lots of people would be in the towns for market days, helping diseases to spread during that time as well. So, in terms of water and waste, in the villages, fresh water was obtained from springs or wells, or indeed the rivers. Springs were sometimes shared with animals, which meant that the water was not always clean. In contrast, water in towns often brought piped water in through what were called conduits, which would have been lead pipes. The earliest conduits were actually built by the church, who had the money to actually pay for these. Water sellers sold water from leather sacks and would go around door to door selling those. And of course, there's no doubt that some people in the town would have used the river within the town for water as well. In terms of villages, waste in the villages, there would have been what was called a midden, or a waste heap, that was put in the garden. So all the waste would basically be heaped up. And then eventually some of that would probably be used as fertilizer for the farmland. Cesspits was constructed near some village houses. So a cesspit is basically a big hole in the ground and the waste goes into the pit. In towns, public latrines or toilets were put up in market squares. Rakers were employed, sometimes known as scavengers, to remove waste from the towns. Cesspits were used and then would be cleared out by somebody called a gong farmer, and they would remove the waste. They would take it outside the town walls to be used on fields, or sometimes they tipped it into streams. Towards the end of medieval towns, we start to get these things called dung heaps on the outside of towns. And then trades, of course, created waste in the towns. The towns tended to have in the street almost like a little open sewer running through them. So that would be pretty filthy, and that would spread disease as well. In terms of medieval diets, in terms of bread, good harvests would lead to a plentiful supply of bread. So this is one of the staple foods. The poor tended to eat rye bread, which could contain a fungus that caused the illness ergotism, which would mostly affect poor people. Very nasty disease, as we've already seen. In terms of drinking, ale and cider was drunk. Ale was made by boiling water, which killed the germs, not that they knew that, and barley, which is full of nutrients. Cider was made using apples. They even had a drink based from honey, which was called mead. Most people tended to drink these ales, the weak beers basically, and those drinks were healthier than the water in towns. So that's what most people were drinking in medieval times. In terms of meat and fish, if people could afford it, they would try and eat a wide variety of meat. The rich consulted guides about how eating meat would impact on their humours. There is a belief that what you ate affected your health. The church did not allow meat to be eaten on Fridays, so fish was eaten instead. Wealthy people also ate cheese, eggs, nuts and fruit, and honey was used as a sweetener. A big staple diet, particularly of poorer people, was called pottage, which was a thick vegetable soup widely eaten by medieval peasants. But the diet of ordinary people was pretty limited. So for ordinary people, for poorer people, meat, fish, eggs and cheese were luxuries. They might be eaten on special occasions, such as a holy day, for example. So there's a big focus there on that diversity of experience. Okay, so in 1348 we had our big epidemic, the Black Death. Now the Black Death was a huge epidemic which affected England between 1348 and 1350. It first arrived on the south coast at Weymouth in 1348, spread towards London by 1349 and up into the north of England by 1350. Now, other diseases were very common in the Middle Ages. We talked about ergotism. There were diseases like typhoid and dysentery, for example. But the Black Death was the worst epidemic. And we believe it came to England via Asia and Europe along trade routes. And it was mainly spread by fleas living on rats. But of course, medieval people did not know this. Now, there are 3 different types of plague during this time. But the most common one was the bubonic plague, which has probably had the most attention. So the bubonic plague, the features of that were buboes, which are swellings that would appear in the armpits and the groin, fever and high temperature, blisters which were fluid filled, and death within a few days. Septicemic plague symptoms would be bleeding, diarrhea and vomiting. Fingers, toes and nose would turn black. And then pneumonic plague would be coughing up blood, chest pains, trouble breathing. Death would usually take place in 2 days if someone was going to die from that one. So in terms of cause-consequence, medieval people just did not understand the causes of the Black Death, and it meant the approaches they took to deal with it had a pretty limited impact. So medieval people believed that the plague was caused by God, punishing them for their sins. Some people believed in astrology, the unusual movements of the planets. Many people believed in the idea of miasma, that bad smells were causing the Black Death. Some people believe that people got plague if their humours were out of balance, such as if they were eating a poor diet, for example. And some people believe you could even catch the plague by looking someone in the eye. So people tried lots of different treatments, tying live toads or chickens to the buboes to draw out the disease. There were lots and lots of different remedies that were tried in lots of different local areas and lots of different sources that tell us about that. Bloodletting, removing blood to balance the humours, praying to God for forgiveness, perhaps lighting a candle, or indeed distancing themselves from others. There's stories of the rich moving to the countryside to find pure air, lodgers and even children being forced out onto the streets by householders. The government response during this time was pretty limited. The king at the time was called King Edward III. He famously wrote a letter to the Mayor of London in 1349 saying, "Cause the human feces and other filth lying in the streets and lanes to be removed with all speed to places far distant, and to cause the city and suburbs to be cleansed from all odour and to be kept clean as it used to be in the time of preceding mayors, so that no greater cause of mortality may arise from such smells." So it's a great source, that, and really gives us that focus that people believe that bad smells cause disease, the miasma, of course. So what did medieval people do? Well, most people during the Black Death epidemic were relying on their own selves to protect themselves from the Black Death. They couldn't really rely on the government, so some people ran away, and some people sought pure air, so they would burn herbs like rosemary to purify the air in their houses, or go around with a pocket full of flowers, for example. They might, for example, burn candles to try and create nicer smells. There'd be flagellants, much more common in Italy and in Europe but flagellants were people that believed that God had caused the Black Death. So they whipped themselves to try and gain God's forgiveness. The church encouraged people to confess their sins and ask for forgiveness. There was, of course, stories of priests actually spreading the Black Death by going to see people and giving the last rites and that type of thing. Some people shut themselves away in their own homes and kept themselves isolated. There wasn't really a proper system of quarantine during that time, although that was done in some European countries like Italy, for example. And avoiding other people, so some householders forced lodgers or even children out into the street if they showed any signs of the disease. So some awareness there about how the Black Death could spread from person to person. Okay, so last up, public health in late medieval towns. So the first there, you've got an artistic interpretation there of Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire. And one of the key aspects for monasteries was that they needed clean water, partly for the religious ceremonies. They thought it was important to have clean water. So religious communities, they needed clean water for religious ceremonies, as well as the day-to-day washing of linen and keeping the people clean in the monastery. It was a Christian duty to care for the sick, but also there's the phrase cleanliness is next to godliness. The idea that keeping clean was a sign of having a good Christian faith. Religious institutions were rich and powerful, so they could actually pay. They actually were able to pay for the water pipes to be laid over long distances. Some monasteries had hospitals or infirmaries attached to them. And there is evidence of some basic understanding of healthcare in that these infirmaries were kept away from the main monastery buildings, so an idea of keeping ill people isolated. So monasteries very much set the standard for good public health during this time. In Fountains Abbey, for example, they had the latrines positioned over the river, which would then flow and take the waste away. Towards the end of this time period, the richer people were tending to spend more of the money on themselves and making their own sort of water systems. So the monasteries got kind of less donations and they became less wealthy and standards dropped. So we did see in this time period some changes made to public health in towns. So as towns grew wealthier, citizens gave money to improve public health in the towns rather than giving that money to the churches or the monasteries. So this meant that by 1500, standards in many monasteries in terms of hygiene had dropped and respect for the church had declined. Towns began to grow. Wealthy townspeople began to fund the development of new conduits and indeed public toilets, or privies as they're known as well. So some examples of that: problem of filthy roads and marketplaces. There were some examples of marketplaces being paved and paid for out of tax. That happened in Shrewsbury in 1301. Dung heaps being moved to the edge of towns. That happened in places like Bristol and York, linked to the idea of miasma. Dumping waste in Norwich, 1287 to 89, they were naming and shaming waste dumpers. That would lead to a purer water supply. And then guilds are really important. So guilds are associations or groups of food producers or linked to a particular trade that set standards, and they could actually fine producers who did not meet them. So there's examples of people being fined in Winchester in 1329 for trying to sell poor quality meat. So that helped to improve food standards in medieval towns as well. London took the lead on public health care. It had provided piped water to its people since the 1230s. Strong evidence for this is that the population actually grew between 1250 and 1500, showing that some of these measures had helped to preserve people's health. The Lord Mayor of London and the aldermen were responsible for keeping the city healthy. So aldermen are like almost like city councillors, officials, the Mayor of London in charge. And we saw, of course, that order from King Edward III to the Mayor of London. So there's some examples here of what was done in London post the Black Death, after the Black Death. So 1385, a warden was appointed to check whether London streets and the banks of the River Thames were clear of filth and dunghills. 1415, the Mayor of London ordered the rebuilding of a latrine at Moorgate because it had been flooding neighbouring properties with sewage. In the 1430s, the Mayor of London organised the extension of the pipes that supplied London with clear spring water. He and other rich citizens left money in their wills to improve water supplies and build new public latrines. And in 1479, the gong farmers and the pavers of London formed their own guild to repair road surfaces and cesspits. Gong farmers tended to be quite well paid, and it was a pretty nasty job, so it's a good job that they were. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. That's been a GCSE history revision video on people's health through time, focusing on the medieval times 1250 to 1500. Thank you very much. Bye bye.